You guys already knew about genes and genetics. In our discussion of genes and genetics, I found out you knew less than I had anticipated. So what did we say then on Ash Wednesday a gene is?
A DNA cell carried down from your family.
So it's DNA, it's heritable, and it codes for something. Protein. So it codes for protein. What a lot of students really struggle with when we talk about genes then is that a gene is just a section of DNA where those nucleotides, so where that particular sequence of A, C, T, or G code for a sequence of amino acids. Amino acids, our biochem chapter, right? How many different amino acids are there, do we remember?
Four.
There's 4 different nucleotides. More than 7.
12.
25. 34.
16.
Oh, 34?
23.
No, wait.
34.
20.
And?
So every single protein you have that makes you up is made out of the same 20 things, basically, which was coded for the same, or out of the same set of instructions of A, T, C's, and G's. So if we look at it, it would be you guys recognize that? Excellent. That's our DNA double helix, where only one tiny section of that is one gene.
Like every curve?
Well, it's not necessarily every curve.
Every
What it is, so you have 3 billion of these rungs on the ladder. So of those lines that I'm making thicker that you can see, you have 3 billion in all of the DNA in every cell you have. Roughly 1,000 to 3,000 of them makes one gene, depending on what the gene is. So 1,000 to 3,000 nucleotides make a gene.
We have to know that? Like 1,000?
That's probably not a bad idea.
You said 1,000 to 3,000 nucleotides make a gene.
Yep, so 1,000 to 3,000 A, T, C's, or G's. And the reason you get so much variability in that is just because of the size of the different genes or the different protein products that get made. Your hemoglobin is more, so the stuff that's in your blood that carries oxygen, is more, it's on the high end. Your hair, it's just a protein product coded for in your DNA, is fewer because it's the same protein product, just a lot of it. So this is the stuff that gets passed down in those chromosomes that we looked at last chapter. But we decided when we last week that what makes each of us different is we all have the same genes. So we all have a gene that codes for hair color and eye color. We all have a gene that codes for IQ and height. We all have genes that code for hemoglobin. Every protein product, we all have the same genes. It's the version of the gene that you get that makes us different. Those versions have a particular name. What do you call a version or a type of a gene? It's an allele.
Alright, I get it.
So let's pick a human trait. Can you guys think of a trait that people have?
Eye color, height.
Eye color, hair, height.
Skin color?
So for eye color, the different versions that you could have, so this is the gene. Actually, there are many genes, but that's the gene. The version or allele that you would get would be blue,
Red.
brown.
Red.
We're talking about eye color here.
Green. Red.
Green. Hazel.
Blue, brown, hazel.
Gray.
Green.
Red. Black.
Didn't you have red?
Why would it be red?
You're albino.
What does that mean?
Your skin is.
Okay, so skin has a natural pigment called melanin. Your body makes a natural pigment. It's called melanin, and it's what gives us all different shades of skin tone. People with a particular mutation in the gene for melanin, so they got an allele where they don't produce that pigment, that's why you would have red eyes, why your hair wouldn't have color, why your skin would be essentially what is pure white. It's because you don't make the pigment melanin. That's just a protein that your body produces. Some of you are better at producing melanin than others. Those of you who are bad at producing melanin, you're the ones who turn lobster red if you go sit in the sun. Those of you who are particularly adept at producing melanin are the ones who tan very well. A simple difference, right? And somehow that particular difference, the amount of melanin you secrete, changes how we treat people.
Is it melon or melanin?
Melanin. M-E-L-A-N-I-N.
Melon.
So eye colors, the standard eye colors we have, blue, brown, hazel, and green, those are all different versions that you can get. The color your eyes end up being depends what two versions you get. Because remember, for every gene you have 2 copies of it. One from mom and one from dad. So every gene you have 2 versions. Let's see here. Let's try this one.
So is that like the chromosomes?
All of your genes are located on chromosomes. Remember on our karyotypes, when we looked at our chromosomes and they had like striped lines on the karyotype? Each of those stained striped lines represents a region that's a gene. That's what they do, is they stain them with the gene color. And you have 2, one from mom, one from dad. So when you saw a karyotype lined up, numbers 1 through 23, the 2 that are next to each other at number 1, they contain the corresponding genes. So number 1 would have, for example, height. The gene that codes for growth hormone would be on number 1, and you'd have the version from mom on one of them, the version from dad on the other. Now notice I said it's growth hormone. We don't specifically have one gene that controls our height. We actually have a whole suite or complex of them that control height, one of them being your growth hormone, how much you produce or don't produce. And that's also influenced by diet. So let's take a look at something that's less, it's a little bit more straightforward. We'll say that. Thank you. So what you guys just did was a genetic test. It's a simple genetic test for whether or not you can taste things that are bitter. That's the flavor, which is why some of you, as soon as you tasted the paper, were like, ugh,
Oh, wait.
because that's a bitter flavor.
How am I supposed to know what that means?
If you didn't make a ugh, you likely don't taste bitter things. So this is, you asked me, you said, is this good or bad, right? Currently, it doesn't actually matter. I mean, if you don't like bitter things, people who, by the way, can taste it tend to stay away from some of the more bitter vegetables. You don't like broccoli, you don't like Brussels sprouts because they're very strong and bitter flavors.
That's why
So some of you are like, yes, I now have a scientific reason to go home and tell my parents that I dislike those vegetables. The reason for it, the reason it used to exist in the population, and it is more prevalent in Northern European populations, and the reason for that is because there is a particular compound that you're actually tasting for in that region of your tongue. That compound was found in poisonous vegetables in Northern Europe. So your ability to taste that bitterness would be inherited from ancestors who, as soon as they tasted a bitter thing, would spit it out. It kept them alive. So it conferred a genetic advantage. You know, not eating poisonous plants because they taste bad is a good way to stay alive.
Wait, is that only on the tip of your tongue?
And bitter, yes, it'd be the tip of your tongue. So what's odd here is the number of people that can and cannot taste it is perfectly divided down the middle. That is exceptionally rare. Typically in a classroom, it errs on the side of many, many more people can taste it than cannot. You'll notice then for the PTC paper, there are two alleles. So the gene here would be so the gene is, can you taste bitter things? I know. The allele is, what two alleles are there possible here? Your choices are yes, I can, or so the gene is, can you taste bitter? The allele, your choices are yes or no. Now, what's interesting about that is you all have two copies of that. And we're going to call being able to taste bitterness capital B, so yes. And not being able to, we're just going to call lowercase b. You all have two copies of that gene.
Are we doing those charts?
You have two copies of those genes.
So you have two copies of the yes and the no?
Well, you have two copies of either yes or no, or you have one yes or one no. So you got one gene from your mother and one gene from your biological father. And what that means is you have, we call it a genotype. It's what your genes say. The two alleles that you have is your genotype. And here, there are three possible genotypes that you can have for this gene. Yep.
Wait, can you repeat what
Yep. It's the alleles that you have. So your genotype are whatever alleles you have. And everybody has two. So whenever we talk about a genotype, it should be two letters. The potential genotypes here are you got a bitter tasting gene from mom and a bitter tasting gene from dad. So you could be capital B, capital B. Or you could have gotten a bitter tasting gene from one parent and a no, I can't taste bitter things from another parent. Or neither of your parents gave you a bitter tasting gene. The 13 of you who said, nope, can't taste it, your genotype would be this last one. You were lowercase b, lowercase b. That corresponds to the trait in question that we call a phenotype. The genotype is what alleles you have. The phenotype is how the trait appears or manifests in the living thing. So either you can taste bitter things or you can't.
What does it mean again?
how the gene appears. So what you actually see in the living thing. The genotype, lowercase b, corresponds to the phenotype, you cannot taste bitter. You don't produce the necessary compound in your taste buds to be able to perceive bitterness. If you have a capital B in your genotype at all, so either you're a capital B, or a capital B, lowercase b, you can taste bitter things. So the phenotype that corresponds to these two is the ability to taste bitter things. We call the difference between these two alleles dominant and recessive. If you have a gene that's dominant, if that allele is present, that's the allele that you have the phenotype for. So how to describe it? If you have a capital B, one capital B, then you will be able to taste bitter. That's dominant. You don't need to. It dominates the other allele, so it masks its presence. Do me a favor, stick your tongue out.
Good.
Now roll it. Can you roll it? If you can roll your tongue, you have the gene that gives you the ability to do so. There's usually one person in every class who cannot roll their tongue. There we go. We have two.
Wait, who said they couldn't?
Devin can't. It doesn't matter how long you try. You will never be able to roll your tongue if you can't do it.
Can you roll your tongue?
I taught
Yes.
I used to not be able to go like roll like this.
Me too.
Well, I mean like folding your tongue in half.
I know. I can do that.
That's,
I'm just letting you know.
it is an exceptionally silly trait, but it's inherited. It's a genetic trait. Dominant are the people who are able to fold their tongues in half. Recessive are those who cannot. So I'll give you an example of the potential types here. And this should be, for most of you, pretty simple to figure out. You can actually genotype your entire family very easily. Either you're a tongue roller or you're not. Those are your two alleles, tongue roller or not. The ability to roll one's tongue is dominant. So if you can't, that's recessive.
Wait, which one's recessive?
Not being able to. So these two genotypes would belong to individuals who are able to fold their tongues in half, as opposed to this second, those individuals would not be able to. Now, when we were kids, we were not the most delightful children on the planet, my sisters and I, and we used to make fun of my mom because she can't fold her tongue in half. She's never been able to. She used to sit and try for a really long time, which I don't get because she's a nurse and like understands how genes work and knows that this is genetic. But we were not the kindest children, so we'd make fun of her for not being able to do it. But because I know that my mother cannot roll her or fold her tongue, which genotype does that mean I am? I can.
Capital B, lowercase. Capital R, lowercase.
So I am capital R, lowercase r. How about my sisters?
The same thing.
I don't know.
Or two.
They're your sisters, they're the same thing, same gene.
No. We don't know.
If you have the same parents, you have the same gene.
We have the same parents.
We don't know.
It is a guarantee that one of each of my sisters will be, so there's me, my sister Sarah, and my sister Sue. What can I guarantee one of their two alleles is? I know for sure they have a little r. Why? Because mom
Has a little.
only has two small r's. That's all she had to give us. As opposed to dad,
Bob.
Oh.
Bob.
we don't know what his other one is, do we? How do we know that one of his is a capital?
Because you can.
Because I can. Both of my sisters can as well. Since both of my sisters can, what is likely that my dad's second allele is? It is likely, it is possible, but we don't know. Here's what we do with this information. This is actually how geneticists determine traits that you can and cannot pass on and you will and will not pass on. We create what we call a Punnett square out of this information. Punnett squares were first designed by the father of genetics, who we'll talk a bit about probably tomorrow. But Punnett squares are simply boxes that are used to predict the potential genotypes of offspring. So we'll use pea plants because it's a popular choice for genetics. And their height. There are two choices for pea plants. They will either be tall or short. Tall and short, are those genotypes or phenotypes?
No.
Types.
Types.
They're types. We've narrowed that down. In fact, we could say they're no types. We just don't know whether it's G or phi. Height. Tall or short? Is that genotype or phenotype?
Gina. Gina.
That's what we see when we look at the individual. I can see your phenotypes, but I cannot see your genotypes. I can't just look at you and decide what your genotype is. The choices of allele, then, will either be tall or short. Those are the two different versions you can inherit. You can't have a medium pea plant. You have either tall or short
What's considered
for a pea plant.
Double T. Okay.
Doesn't work that way in humans. Only pea plants will that work for height.
You mad?
Those are the three possible genotypes for tall and short of a pea plant. Which two correspond to tall?
TT.
with the capital?
Capital T.
And the short?
Lowercase t.
These are terms we use in genetics to describe genotypes. If you are a homozygote, you have two of the same alleles. That means that either you're both capitals or both lowercase. So we have to say homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Heterozygotes have two different alleles. Which of our genotypes can be called heterozygous? I'm confident you guys have done Punnett squares before. Is this true? Don't remember?
Probably did, yeah, on the DC Elementary School.
Just max. That's what we did once. We did it.
Elementary schools.
If you were to allow a short pea plant to pollinate a tall pea plant that is homozygous, what are the two genotypes here? So what one goes with short?
Small orchid.
And which one goes with homozygous tall?
Big.
Now, to predict any of the possible outcomes for their offspring, whether they'll be tall or short, we simply take the two alleles from one parent and put them on one side, and the two alleles from another parent and put them on the other. Always writing the dominant first, we then fill in the boxes. So the first box would be capital T, lowercase t. So what's the genotype of all of their offspring?
Don't be tall.
Genotype of all of their offspring.
Oh,
Capital T.
4 of 4 are heterozygotes, and the phenotype is
tall.
100% tall. Create a Punnett square in your notebook or on your outline, crossing a heterozygote with a heterozygote at tall. So, two heterozygous parents. So you have heterozygous tall pea plant with a heterozygous tall pea plant. And tell me how many of their offspring would be, what ratio would be tall and what ratio would be short. There you go. Thanks. Let's see if your answers all match.
Oops. Shall I write the stuff on
You
the
can write the
side?
genotype of the ratio.
Right.
If your answer matches Scott's, you are 100% correct. That's what we do with that information. This is what we call classic Mendelian genetics. Gregor Mendel is the father of genetics.